Quick prelude for some context around this video. I love Batman, always have, probably always will. I grew up watching 5 different Batman-adjacent animated series, 3 different film iterations, Burton, Schumacher, and Nolan, spent countless Halloweens as the Caped Crusader, and played half a dozen video games starring the Dark Knight. So it was a no-brainer when I was asked to write about a video game that elicits a specific emotion, I chose to write about Batman Arkham Asylum. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my rambling about a game that I love. Hope you enjoy. On May 30th, 1939, Bob Kane and Bill Finger debuted the character of Batman in Detective Comics number 27. While the character has gone through many changes and iterations throughout the past 83 years, one thing has remained consistent: his ability to strike fear into the hearts of criminals. Fast forward to 2009, and Rocksteady Studios releases the game that would define their place in the gaming industry: Batman Arkham Asylum. While marketed as an action-adventure game, the story can be quite scary for most first-time playthroughs. Using narrative techniques, unique enemies, thrilling boss fights, and a haunting environment, Batman Arkham Asylum instills fear in every individual that plays it. In order to understand how the game sets the player up for a night of terror, one must first know the premise of the game. Written by Paul Dini, one of the lead creatives behind Batman the Animated Series, the narrative feels right at home in the Batman mythos. After his latest encounter with the Joker, Batman personally escorts him back to the asylum. Batman knows this time it was too easy. Something's wrong, but he can't quite put his finger on it. Once they arrive, the Joker springs his master plan and takes control of the asylum, trapping Batman inside with the inmates. Both the player and Batman are left unprepared as they're immediately thrown into a tutorial-esque fight with recently released inmates. While these enemies are easily dispatched, more lie further down the hall, and greater threats lurk deeper in the asylum walls. From this point on, players will never feel safe again until the completion of the game. Batman is always being hunted, and the endless number of enemies never seem to run out. Rather than the traditional action approach of previous Batman games, this entry instead focused on the fear-based and detective elements of the character. Even if players begin to feel comfortable with combat mechanics and clearing out areas, enemies are constantly changing, always leaving Batman and the player one step behind. For example, there are certain areas of the map that can require players to pass through and clear the room of enemies using stealth, the game's signature detective vision, and safe spots such as gargoyles or the rafters of a room. If the player is spotted in certain scenarios, they are met with a game over and must restart. One might quickly dispatch the armed guards in this room on their first go-around, but the next time the player passes through this room, it could now be rigged with booby traps, preventing the player from using these safe spots. The constant need for adaptation leaves the player on their toes and never feeling truly safe. Additionally, later in the game, different enemy types are introduced that may require more than just a simple punch to take them down. Enemies wielding knives or stun batons must be dodged or stunned before a hit can be landed. The only way to clear areas of the map of enemies for certain is to complete the main story. Uncertainty can be a key factor in every horror game. Not knowing what comes next is what keeps players on edge and always frightened. Another staple of any action or superhero video game are boss fights. These are fights that usually happen within a contained area with an enemy stronger than usual. While some boss fights are simple and rely on combat, others require different methods of problem solving. There is no exception to these concepts in Arkham Asylum. However, each boss is presented in a unique way that makes them more threatening and scarier than one would expect. Thanks to the in-story explanation of the Titan formula, every boss is larger than Batman, even the ones that wouldn't traditionally be an extreme threat, leaving players severely disadvantaged. For example, one might not normally find themselves afraid of Poison Ivy. However, she uses the Titan formula to grow her plants to unbelievable size. Large characters like Bane or Titan Thugs require crashing them into walls or disorientating them before you can attack. With the constant feeling of being weaker than these bosses and the need for a variety of strategies, players can never truly feel safe during these fights. Along with the previously mentioned boss fights, there are also two that rely very heavily on the fear aspect of the game. What makes these two fights stand out amongst the other is they remove the player's ability to fight back. De-powerment is another essential and commonly used factor in horror-based games. Taking away the skills that most action-adventure games and boss fights revolve around make these two encounters terrifying for players. The two boss segments in question are those with the Scarecrow and Killer Croc. For those unfamiliar with the character, Dr. Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow, forces his enemies to live through their worst nightmares, using his signature fear toxin gas. His presence alone makes the player uncomfortable, appearing as a demon you'd see on Halloween night. During his time in the asylum, Batman encounters Crane 3 times throughout the night. Each time, Batman is subjected to his greatest fears of losing his family, friends, and his own sanity. Meanwhile, the player is helpless to watch, even subjected to their own scares at some points. During one of the player's encounters with Crane, they are treated to the famous glitch or crash scene that even those that aren't familiar with the game know about. After Batman is exposed to the toxin during the third encounter, the game appears to crash and corrupt the save file, restarting the game. This meta aspect of the hallucination causes immediate panic in the player, causing them to think they've lost hours of progress before realizing it's a trick. Even then, this is just one instance where Jonathan Crane makes the player fear their next move. What also makes these encounters with Crane so unique to the traditional boss fights are that they remove the player's ability to fight back. During the first 2 encounters, the player has no choice to play a giant game of hide and seek with a giant version of Crane. The player must duck and hide between different structures to get close enough to surprise him and break the illusion. This removal of combat, both fist fighting and stealth, leaves the player feeling scared and defenseless, unable to solve this problem with their fist like almost every other enemy encounter in the game. Even in earlier encounters, where the player was forced into stealth, the game still allowed you to perform stealth attacks on enemies. To force players to do nothing but hide strips them of all strength or bravery in this situation. After the player finally defeats Crane for the last time, they must venture into the lair of Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc, to find a cure for the Titan formula. Now the player already feels a sense of fear and anxiety, venturing into the decrepit sewer system of the asylum that Croc now calls home. It wouldn't be a video game if there wasn't a water level. From the low lighting and crumbling architecture to the murky water with Croc hunting beneath, there is plenty to fear from an atmospheric sense. The player must move across Croc's lair using the floating pieces of wood in the water, but cannot move too fast or he attacks. Until Croc attacks, the player cannot see him, and when he does, they are provided with a time limit before he grabs them and instantly kills Batman. Like Scarecrow, the player cannot fight Croc with their fist. They must instead have a quick trigger finger to use their gadgets against the giant creature. The continued de-powerment throughout these boss fights forces players into unknown waters, forcing them to learn new strategies on the fly. Finally, we should take a look at how the game uses its environments to discomfort the player and make for a terrifying adventure. Asylums have been used throughout history and popular media as a central horror location. Thanks to the history of inmate abuse, a feeling of vulnerability and entrapment, and social expectations, many people fear being sent to or even visiting one of these hospitals. It is because of this that Arkham Asylum is the perfect location for Batman and the player's worst night of terror to unfold. The asylum itself is a mix of sci-fi and gothic architecture, some of the 2 most used settings for horror storylines. Think of how many horror films or novels you have read that include a sci-fi style medical center or a gothic mansion. It almost evokes a familiar feeling of Resident Evil 2's RCPD and the Umbrella Labs. No matter where the player ventures into the building, there is never a calm or welcoming sight. On top of this design choice, players are also trapped inside the asylum for many hours of the game, giving the building a claustrophobic feeling. The tight, endless halls can leave players lost for hours if they can't understand the map correctly. This feeling of being trapped, like a prisoner, makes players never feel comfortable or safe in the asylum, but rather exposed and vulnerable at all times. During my first playthrough, I found myself lost in the never-ending hallways and elevators. It isn't until about an hour into the game that the player can finally leave the initial building and explore the island. Though a welcome sight to the claustrophobic halls, the surrounding waters on all sides doesn't bode well for any hope of escape. The player cannot swim, and landing in the water forces Batman to grapple back to safety. Instead, players are greeted by the moon and more of Joker's men. Even outside, the player can never feel safe, always in the scope of a sniper looming overhead, being forced to hide once more. The feeling of isolation and no escape can drive a player mad with fear as they attempt to make their way across the island. As will become a staple of the Arkham series, the map continues to evolve as the story progresses. On one end of the island, Ivy's plants grow to massive sizes, destroying pathways and architecture around the island. Meanwhile, Joker and his men began to decorate the asylum as their own twisted funland. They turned the visitor center into a shrine to Joker, decorating the outside with an image of his face and building him a throne inside. Bodies of allies, guards, and even enemies killed via friendly fire begin to decorate the halls. This constant reminder of death hangs over Batman's head and haunts both him and the player. As you can see, while Batman is usually the one striking fear into his enemies, it is instead him and the player that are afraid in Batman Arkham Asylum. The story of Batman being trapped for a night at a disadvantage with his greatest enemies is enough to make the player uneasy. They too must survive the night, combating in some tough boss battles, some of which they can't even fight back during. These fights instead force players to move with care and fear their every move. The settings of these fights also don't help to calm the player's nerves. A horror story staple, the Asylum is the perfect setting for this horrifying tale. Using these elements, Rocksteady kicked off their Batman trilogy with the terrifying experience that is Batman Arkham Asylum. Thank you all for taking the time to watch. If you liked this, I have more videos on the way, including some on the remaining entries in the Arkham series. If that interests you, please like and subscribe for more. Thank you and enjoy your day.